Stolen Legacy. Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy by George G. M. James. Chapter 4. The Egyptians educated the Greeks. 1. The effects of the Persian conquest. A. Immigration restrictions against the Greeks are removed, and Egypt is thrown open to Greek research. Owing to the practice of piracy, in which the Ionians and Carians were active, the Egyptians were forced to make immigration laws restricting the immigration of the Greeks and punishing their infringement by a capital punishment, i.e., the sacrifice of the victim. Before the time of Psammiticus, the Greeks were not allowed to go beyond the coast of Lower Egypt, but during his reign and that of Amasis, those conditions were modified. For the first time in Egyptian history, Ionians and Carians were employed as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. 670 BC. Interpretation was organized through a body of interpreters, and the Greeks began to gain useful information concerning the culture of the Egyptians. In addition to these changes, King Amasis removed the restrictions against the Greeks and permitted them to enter Egypt and settle in Naucratis. About the same time, i.e., the reign of Amasis, the Persians, through Cambyses, invaded Egypt, and the whole country was thrown open to the researches of the Greeks. B. The genesis of Greek Enlightenment. The Persian invasion did not only provide the Greeks with ample research, but stimulated the creation of prose history in Ionia. Heretofore, the Greeks had little or no accurate knowledge of Egyptian culture, but their contact with Egypt resulted in the genesis of their enlightenment. C. Students from Ionia and the islands of the Aegean visit Egypt for their education. Just as in our modern times, countries like the United States, England, and France are attracting students from all parts of the world on account of their leadership in culture, so was it in ancient times. Egypt was supreme in the leadership of civilization, and students from all parts flocked to that land, seeking admission into her mysteries or wisdom system. The immigration of Greeks to Egypt for the purpose of their education began as a result of the Persian invasion, 525 BC, and continued until the Greeks gained possession of that land and access to the royal library through the conquest of Alexander the Great. Alexandria was converted into a Greek city, a center of research, and the capital of the newly created Greek Empire, under the rule of Ptolemies. Egyptian culture survived and flourished, under the name and control of the Greeks, until the edicts of Theodosius in the 4th century AD, and that of Justinian in the 6th century AD, which closed the mystery temples and schools as elsewhere mentioned. Concerning the fact that Egypt was the greatest education center of the ancient world, which was also visited by the Greeks, reference must again be made to Plato in the Timaeus, who tells us that Greek aspirants to wisdom visited Egypt for initiation, and that the priest of Sais used to refer to them as children in the mysteries. As regards the visit of Greek students to Egypt for the purpose of their education, the following are mentioned simply to establish the fact that Egypt was regarded as the educational center of the ancient world, and that, like the Jews, the Greeks also visited Egypt and received their education. 1. It is said that during the reign of Amasis, Thales, who is said to have been born about 585 BC, visited Egypt and was initiated by the Egyptian priest into the mystery system and science of the Egyptians. We are also told that during his residence in Egypt, he learned astronomy, land surveying, mensuration, engineering, and Egyptian theology. 2. It is said that Pythagoras, a native of Samos, traveled frequently to Egypt for the purpose of his education. Like every aspirant, he had to secure the consent and favor of the priest, and we are informed by Diogenes that a friendship existed between Polycrates of Samos and Amasis, king of Egypt. That Polycrates gave Pythagoras letters of introduction to the king, who secured for him an introduction to the priest. First to the priest of Heliopolis, then to the priest of Memphis, and lastly to the priest of Thebes, to each of whom Pythagoras gave a silver goblet. We are also further informed through Herodotus, Jablonsk, and Pliny that after severe trials, including circumcision, had been imposed upon him by the Egyptian priest, he was finally initiated into all their secrets. That he learned the doctrine of metempsychosis, of which there was no trace before in the Greek religion. That his knowledge of medicine and strict system of dietetic rules distinguished him as a product of Egypt, where medicine had attained its highest perfection, and that his attainments in geometry corresponded with the ascertained fact that Egypt was the birthplace of that science. In addition, we have the statements of Plutarch, Demetrius, and Antisthenes that Pythagoras founded the science of mathematics among the Greeks, and that he sacrificed to the Muses, when the priest explained to him the properties of the right-angled triangle. 3. According to Diogenes Laertius and Herodotus, Democritus is said to have been born about 400 BC, and to have been a native of Abdera in Miletus. We are also told by Demetrius in his treatise on, quote, people of the same name, end quote, and by Antisthenes in his treatise on, quote, succession, that Democritus traveled to Egypt for the purpose of his education and received the instruction of the priest. We also learn from Diogenes and Herodotus that he spent 5 years under the instruction of the Egyptian priest, and that after the completion of his education, he wrote a treatise on the sacred characters of Moreau. In this respect, we further learn from Origen that circumcision was compulsory, and one of the necessary conditions of initiation to a knowledge of the hieroglyphics and sciences of the Egyptians, and it is obvious that Democritus, in order to obtain such knowledge, must have submitted also to that rite. Origen, who was a native of Egypt, wrote as follows: no one among the Egyptians either studied geometry or investigated the secrets of astronomy unless circumcision had been undertaken. 4. Concerning Plato's travels, we are told by Hermodorus that at the age of 28, Plato visited Euclid at Megara in company with other pupils of Socrates, and that for the next 10 years he visited Cyrene, Italy, and finally Egypt, where he received instruction from the Egyptian priest. 5. With regards to Socrates and Aristotle, and the majority of pre-Socratic philosophers, history seems to be silent on the question of their traveling to Egypt, like the few other students here mentioned, for the purpose of their education. It is enough to say that in this case the exceptions have proved the rule, that all students who had the means went to Egypt to complete their education. The fact that history fails to supply a fuller account of this type of immigration might be due to some or all of the following reasons. A. The immigration laws against the Greeks up to the time of King Amasis and the Persian invasion. B. Prose history was undeveloped among the Greeks during the period of their educational immigration to Egypt. C. The Greek authorities persecuted and drove students of philosophy into hiding, and consequently, D. Students of the mystery system concealed their movements. Let us remember that Anaxagoras was indicted and imprisoned, that he escaped and fled to his home in Ionia, that Socrates was indicted, imprisoned, and condemned to death, and that both Plato and Aristotle fled from Athens under great suspicion. 2. The effects of the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. A. The Royal Library and Museum, together with temples and other libraries, are looted. As elsewhere mentioned, it was an ancient custom of invading armies to loot libraries and temples in order to capture books and manuscripts which were regarded as great treasures. A few instances would be enough to verify this custom. A. We are informed that during the Persian invasion, beginning with Cambyses, the temples of Egypt were not only stripped of their gold and silver, but rifled for their ancient records. Every Egyptian temple carried a secret library with secret manuscripts and books. B. We are also informed that when Athens was captured by the Romans in 84 BC, the library of books said to have belonged to Aristotle was also captured and taken to Rome. Just as in the invasion of Egypt by the Persians, the invading armies stripped the temples of their gold, silver, and sacred books, and just as in the capture of Athens by the Romans, Sulla carried off the only library of books which he found, so it is to be expected of Alexander the Great in his invasion of Egypt. One of the first things that he and his companions in armies would do would be to search for the treasures of the land and capture them. These were kept in temples and libraries and consisted of gold and silver, out of which the gods and ceremonial vessels were made, and sacred books and manuscripts kept both in libraries and in the, quote, holy of holies of temples. It is my firm belief that this indeed was the great opportunity which Alexander gave Aristotle and enabled him and his pupils to carry off as many books as they wanted from the royal library and to convert it into a research center. Apart from the royal library at Alexandria, there was also another famous library nearby, the, quote, Royal Library of Thebes, the Menetheion, which was founded by Pharaoh Seti. The Menetheion was completed by Ramses II, but little occurs in history about this greatest of Egyptian royal libraries. However, any invading army would first loot the royal library of Alexandria and then would turn their attention to the Menetheion at Thebes. They would also visit the cities of Memphis and Heliopolis and likewise loot their libraries and temples. This was the ancient custom and certainly one of the ways in which the Greeks received their education from Egyptians. It is therefore an erroneous belief that the Greeks on Egyptian soil and through their own native ability set up a great university at Alexandria and turned out great scholars. On the other hand, since it is well known that Egypt was the land of temples and libraries, we can see how comparatively easy it was for the Greeks to strip other Egyptian libraries of their books in order to maintain the new library at Alexandria after it had been already looted by Aristotle and his pupils. The Greeks, i.e. Alexander the Great, Aristotle's school, and the succeeding Ptolemies, converted the Royal Library of Alexandria into a research center. By transferring Aristotle's school and pupils from Athens to this great Egyptian library, and therefore the students who studied there received instructions from Egyptian priests and teachers until they died out. The difficulty of language and interpretation made it imperative for the Greeks to use Egyptian teachers. The Greeks did not carry culture and learning to Egypt, but found it already there, and wisely settled in that country, in order to absorb as much as possible of its culture. B. The Royal Library of Thebes. The Menetheion is described. It was also looted by invading armies. But when we read a brief sketch of the magnificence of the Theban Royal Library, the Menetheion, we even see a better picture and are bound to admit that Egypt was the storehouse of ancient culture, and that culture was preserved in the form of literature stored away in her great libraries and temples. Great as the Royal Library of Alexandria might have been, we see in the Theban Royal Library something far more magnificent and far more representative of the true greatness of our ancient Egypt. On the left of the steps leading to the second court, there is still seen the pedestal of the enormous granite statue of Ramses, the largest that ever existed in Egypt, according to Diodorus. Its height has been calculated at 54 feet, and its weight at 887.25 tons, a marvel to the modern mind. The interior face of the wall of the pylon represents the wars of Ramses III. The osiride pillars of the second court are the monolithal figures, 16 cubits in height, supplying the place of columns. And at the foot of the steps leading from the court to the next hall beyond, there were two sitting statues of the king. The head of one of these was of red granite, known by the name of, quote, Young Memnon, was taken away by Belzoni, and is now a principal ornament of the British Museum. Behind this are the remains of a hall 133 feet broad by 100 feet long, supported by 48 columns, 12 of which are 32 feet in height and 21 feet in circumference. On different parts of the columns and the walls are represented acts of homage by the king to the principal deities of the Theban pantheon, and the gracious promises which they make him in return. In another sculpture, the two chief divinities of Egypt invest him with the emblems of military and civil dominion, i.e. the scimitar, the scourge, and the pedum. Beneath, the 23 sons of Ramses appear in procession, bearing the emblems of their respective high offices in the state, their names being inscribed above them. 9 smaller apartments, 2 of them still preserved and supported by columns, lay behind the hall. On the jambs of the first of these apartments are sculptured Thoth, the inventor of letters, and the goddess Sath, with the title of, quote, Lady of Letters, and President of the Hall of Books, accompanied the former with an emblem of the sense of sight and the latter of hearing. There is no doubt that this is the sacred library, which Diodorus describes as the inscribed dispensary of the mind. It had an astronomical ceiling in which the 12 Egyptian months are represented, with an inscription from which important inferences have been drawn respecting the chronology of the reign of Ramses III. On the walls is a procession of priests carrying the sacred arts, and in the next apartment, the last that now remains, the king is presenting offerings to the various divinities. C. Museum and the Library of Alexander were used as a university. The Museum and Library of Alexandria were so famous in ancient times that we wonder why more information concerning this center of learning has not come down to us. A few references to authoritative sources might no doubt help to enlighten us on this matter. From Sedgwick's and Tyler's History of Science, Chapter 5, pages 87 to 119, we learn that the subjugation of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 330 BC had checked the further development of Greek civilization on its native soil. That after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his vast empire was divided among his generals, and that Alexandria, the new Egyptian capital, fell to Ptolemy. That the city, barely 10 years old, soon became the center of the learned world, and that by 300 BC, the museum, i.e. the seat of the Muses, was founded and became a veritable university of Greek learning. That to the museum was attached a great library with a dining hall and lecture rooms for professors. And this became a school of philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers. Here, for the next 700 years, science had its chief abiding place. Here, however, it should be remembered that the above statement of Sedgwick and Tyler is misleading, since the Greeks did not carry a civilization of their own to Egypt, but on the contrary found a very highly developed Egyptian culture, the survival of which was maintained by the use of Egyptian priests and scholars as teachers. D. A military policy of the Greeks to commandeer information from the Egyptians was put in operation. One of the military policies adopted by the Greek military authorities at Alexandria was the issue of commands to the leading Egyptian priests for information concerning the Egyptian history, philosophy, and religion. As a custom, this is no less ancient than the modern, since it is also a custom in modern times for victorious armies to confer with the men of science of an invaded country, in order to discover whether or not there is anything new in the field of science which they might possess. We would recall how, at the end of World War II, the American scientists conferred with the Japanese scientists at Tokyo. Accordingly, we are told that Ptolemy I Soter, in order to elicit the secrets of Egyptian wisdom or mystery system, ordered Manetho, the high priest of the temple of Isis at Sebentis in Lower Egypt, to write the philosophy and the history of the religion of the Egyptians. Accordingly, Manetho published several volumes concerning these respective fields, and Ptolemy issued an order prohibiting the translation of these books, which had to be kept on reserve in the library for instruction of the Greeks, by the Egyptian priests. Here it becomes quite clear that the first professors of the Alexandrian school were the Egyptian priests, and that the scholars and pupils of Aristotle's transferred school received their training directly from the Egyptian priests. It is also well to note that the chief textbooks of the Alexandrian school were Manetho's books. We are told by Apollodorus, from whom Syncellus drew his information, that Ptolemy II ordered Eratosthenes, the Cyrenian, i.e. a black man and native of Cyrene, and librarian of the Alexandrine Library, to write a chronology of the Theban kings, and that Eratosthenes did so with the aid of the Egyptian hierophants at Thebes. Furthermore, it became the custom during the Greek and Roman occupation to use the services of Egyptian priests and scholars as professors at the Alexandrian school. We are told that during the reign of Theodosius, 378 to 395 AD, the Egyptian professor Horapollo wrote a system of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, the Hieroglyphia of Horapollo, which has been regarded as the best that has come down to modern times. We are also told that this professor taught not only at the Alexandrine school, but also at that of Constantinople. 3. The Egyptians were the first to civilize the Greeks. Greece was first civilized by colonies from Egypt, then from Phoenicia and Thrace. These were under the government of wise men, who not only subdued the ferocity of an ignorant populace by civil institutions, but also cast about them the strong chain of religion and the fear of the gods. Whatever dogmas they had been taught in their respective countries concerning things divine and human, they delivered to these newly formed societies with the object of bringing them under the restraint of virtuous discipline. Pharonius and Cecrops were Egyptians, Cadmus a Phoenician, and Orpheus a Thracian, and each of them, through their colonies, carried into Greece the religious and philosophical tenets of his respective country. The practice of teaching the doctrines of religion to people under the guise of myth originated from the Egyptians and was adopted by the Phoenicians and Thracians and subsequently introduced to the Greeks. According to Strabo, it was not possible in ancient times to lead a promiscuous multitude to religion and virtue by philosophical harangues. This could be effected only by the aid of superstition, by prodigies and fables. The thunderbolt, the aegis, the trident, the spear, torches, and snakes were the instruments made use of by the founders of states to terrify the ignorant and vulgar into subjection. These references must speak for themselves. Cheops and Cecrops were the names which the Greeks used for the Egyptian Khufu, who belonged to the 4th dynasty of the Egyptians, or the Pyramid Age, i.e. 2800 BC. 4. Alexander visits the oracle of Ammon in the oasis of Siwa. No discussion on Alexander's invasion of Egypt would be complete without reference to his famous visit to the oracle of Ammon, situated in the oasis of Siwa. Alexander had placed a garrison in Pelusium, whence he marched through the desert along the eastern bank of the Nile to Heliopolis, where he crossed the river to Memphis, where his fleet had been awaiting him, and where he was welcomed by the Egyptians and crowned as Pharaoh. Having sacrificed to Apis and other gods, Alexander descended the Nile by the Canopic branch and set out on his journey to the oracle of Ammon in the oasis of Siwa. His route was along the coast of Libya, as far as Paratonium, whence he marched through the desert to the oasis of Siwa. What do we suppose was Alexander's motive for visiting the temple of Ammon? Perhaps a brief description of the religious and economic importance of Heliopolis, Memphis, Thebes, and Ammonium might help us to determine what it was. In the first place, these cities were strongholds of the Egyptian religion, where there were many rich temples, schools, and priests, and therefore were representative of the Egyptian religious life. In the second place, these cities were centers of education, and after the Persian invasion, Greek students who traveled to Egypt for the purpose of their education received their training from the priests of one or all of these cities, as elsewhere mentioned. When Pythagoras went to Egypt, he carried a letter of introduction from Polycrates of Samos to King Amasis, who in turn gave him letters of introduction to the priests of Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes. As centers of education, the temples and libraries of these cities contained very valuable books, and in the third place, these regions had been previously captured by the Persians for the very fact of their wealth. This should explain why they included these districts in their satrapy, which paid them an enormous annual tribute amounting to 700 talents of gold. Together with the produce of the fisheries of Lake Moeris, which amounted to a talent a day during the 6 months that the water flowed in from the Nile, and a third part of that sum during the afflux. In addition, Egypt furnished 120,000 medicinae of corn as rations for the Persian troops who were stationed in the White Fort of Memphis. The equivalent of this tribute was 170,000 pounds sterling, and shows the underlying motive not only of the Persian invading armies, but also of all invading armies of antiquity. In this case of Alexander, there is no exception. According to history, the Persians were in occupation of Egypt, and Alexander, having mustered superior forces, went there and drove them out and took possession himself. May I ask this question? Was this a joke, or was there a motive? And if there was a motive, what else could it have been but that Alexander wanted the wealth in books, gold, silver, ivory, slaves, and tribute, which the Persians were extorting from the unfortunate Egyptians? In ancient times, the oracle of Ammon at Siwa was the most celebrated, and Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes were representatives of the best of Egyptian culture. End of chapter 4. Stolen legacy. Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy, by George G. M. James. Chapter 5. The pre-Socratic philosophers and the teachings ascribed to them. It is absolutely necessary here in chapters 5 and 6 to mention the doctrines of the so-called Greek philosophers in order to convince my readers of their Egyptian origin, which is shown in the summaries of conclusions which follow these teachings. It is also necessary to mention them so as to serve the purpose of reference and to meet the convenience of readers. 1. The earlier Ionian school. This group consisted of Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. 1. Thales, supposed to have lived 620 to 546 BC and a native of Miletus, is credited by Aristotle with teaching that A. Water is the source of all living things, B. All things are full of God. Both history and tradition are silent as to how Thales arrived at his conclusions, except that Aristotle attempts to offer his opinion as a reason. That is, that Thales must have been influenced by the consideration of the moisture of nutriment, and based his conclusion on a rationalistic interpretation of the myth of Oceanus. This, however, is regarded as mere conjecture on the part of Aristotle. 2. Anaximander, supposed to have been born 610 BC at Miletus, is credited with the teaching that the origin of all things is, quote, the infinite, or the unlimited, i.e., apeiron, or the boundless. The apeiron is regarded as equivalent to the modern notion of space and the mythological notion of chaos. Both history and tradition are silent as to how Anaximander arrived at his conclusion, but here again we find Aristotle offering his opinion as a reason, i.e., that Anaximander must have supposed that change destroys matter, and that unless the substratum of change is limitless, change must at some time cease. This opinion is, of course, mere conjecture on the part of Aristotle. 3. Anaximenes, also a native of Miletus, and supposed to have died in 528 BC, is credited with the teaching that all things originated from air. Both history and tradition are silent as to how Anaximenes arrived at his conclusion, and all attempts to furnish a reason are regarded as mere conjecture. 2. Pythagoras, born in the Aegean island of Samos, supposedly in 530 BC, the following doctrines have been attributed to Pythagoras. 1. Transmigration, the immortality of the soul, and salvation. This salvation is based upon certain beliefs covering the soul. True life is not to be found here on earth, and what men call life is really death, and the body is the tomb of the soul. Owing to the contamination caused by the soul's imprisonment in the body, it is forced to pass through an indefinite series of reincarnations from the body of one animal to that of another, until it is purged from such contamination. Salvation, in this sense, consists of the freedom of the soul from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, which is common to every soul, and which condition must remain until purification or purgation is completed. Being liberated from the 10 chains of the flesh, and also from successive reincarnations, the soul now acquires her pristine perfection, and the eligibility to join the company of the gods, with whom she dwells forever. This was the reward which the Pythagorean system offered its initiates. 2. The doctrines of A. Opposites, B. The summum bonum, or supreme good, and C. The process of purification. A. The union of opposites creates harmony in the universe. This is true in the case of musical sounds, such as we find in the lyre, where the harmony produced is the result of the mean proportional relation between the length of the two middle strings to that of the two extremes. This is also true in natural phenomena, which are identified with number, whose elements consist of the odd and the even. The even is unlimited because of its quality of unlimited divisibility, and the odd indicates limitation, while the product of both is the unit or harmony. Similarly, do we obtain harmony in the union of positive and negative, male and female, material and immaterial, body and soul. B. The summum bonum, or supreme good, in man is to become godlike. This is an attainment, or transformation, which is the harmony resulting from a life of virtue. It consists in a harmonious relationship between the faculties of man, by means of which his lower nature becomes subordinated to his higher nature. C. The process of purification. The harmony and purification of the soul is attained not only by virtue, but also by other means, the most important among them being the cultivation of the intellect through the pursuit of scientific knowledge and strict bodily discipline. In this process, music also held an important place. The Pythagoreans believed and taught that just as medicine is used to cure the body, so music must be used to cure the soul. Here it might be appropriate to insert the doctrine of the, quote, 3 lives, since it is also a method and means of purification. Quote, mankind is divided into 3 layers: lovers of wealth, lovers of honor, and lovers of wisdom, i.e., philosophers. This last being highest, end quote, according to Pythagoras. Philosophy determined the purification which led to the final salvation of the soul. The cosmological doctrine. All things are numbers. That is to say, not only every object, but the entire universe is an arrangement of numbers. This means that the characteristic of any object is the number by which it is represented. A. Since the universe consists of 10 bodies, namely the 5 stars, the earth, and the counter-earth, then the universe must be represented by the perfect number 10. B. Applied to the space around us, but called by Pythagoreans the boundless or unlimited, it must be taken to mean the measuring out of this boundless into a balanced and harmonious universe, so that everything might receive its proper proportion of it, no more, no less. C. This arrangement seems to suggest the notion of forms capable of receiving a mathematical expression, i.e., a doctrine which later appeared in Plato as the theory of ideas. D. In the center of the universe there is a central fire around which the heavenly bodies fixed in their spheres revolve from west to east, while around all there is the peripheral fire. This motion of the heavenly bodies is regulated in the velocity and produces the harmony of the spheres. 3. The Eleatic philosophers. The Eleatic philosophers include Xenophanes, Parmenides, Zeno, and Melissus. They deal with the problem of change and are credited with introducing the notions of being and becoming. The term Eleatic is derived from Elea, a city in southern Italy where these men are said only to have visited. A. Xenophanes. Born at Colophon in Asia Minor about 370 BC, Xenophanes is credited with the following doctrines. 1. The unity of God. Men err when they ascribe their own characteristics to the gods, for God is all eye, all ear, and all intellect. Again, since there is no becoming, and since plurality depends upon becoming, therefore there is no plurality. Consequently, all is one, and one is all. 2. Temperance. Against the artificial culture of Greece, its luxuries, excess, and fops, Xenophanes is credited with advocating temperance, i.e., plain living, simplicity, moderation, and pure thinking. B. Parmenides is said to have been born at Elea, 540 BC, and to have composed a poem concerning nature, Physios, which contains his doctrines. A. The poem consists of 3 parts. 1. In part 1, the goddess of truth points out that there are 2 paths of knowledge, one leading to a knowledge of truth, and the other to a knowledge of the opinions of men. 2. In part 2, the journey to truth is described and contains a metaphysical doctrine, and in part 3, a cosmology of the apparent. B. The doctrines are as follows. 1. The physical doctrine. Through right reason, logos, holds that being is one and immutable. The senses and common opinion, doxa, are convinced that plurality and change exist around us. 2. The doctrine of truth. Truth consists of the knowledge that being is, and that not being is not. And since not being is not, then being is one and alone. Consequently, being is unproduced and unchangeable. It is impossible for being to produce being, for under such circumstances, being must exist before it begins to exist. 3. The doctrine of the cosmology of the apparent. Here Parmenides simply repeats the Pythagorean doctrine of opposites. All things are composed of light or warmth, and of darkness or cold, and according to Aristotle, the former of these opposites corresponds to being, while the latter to not being. These opposites are equivalent to the male and female principles in the cosmos. 4. The doctrine of the anthropology of the apparent. The life of the soul, i.e., perception and reflection, depends upon the blending of opposites, i.e., of the light, warm, and the dark, cold principles, each of which stands in a physical relation to a corresponding principle in the cosmos. C. Zeno, supposed to be born 490 BC at Elea, was a pupil of Parmenides, according to Plato. His doctrines were intended to be a contradiction of 1. Motion, and 2. Plurality and space. 1. Arguments against motion. A body, in order to move from one point to another, must move through an infinite number of spaces, since magnitude is divisible ad infinitum. B. A body which is in one place is at rest. An arrow in its flight is at each successive moment in one place. Therefore, it is at rest. C. The race between Achilles and the tortoise is intended to contradict the concept of motion. In such a race, Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, because he must first reach the point at which the tortoise started. But in the meantime, the tortoise will have gained more ground. Since Achilles must always reach first the position previously occupied by the tortoise must always keep ahead at every point. 2. Arguments against plurality and space. A. If a measure of corn produces a sound, then each grain ought to produce a sound. This argument is taken from Simplicus, but ascribed to Zeno. B. If being exists in space, then space itself must exist in space, and the process will have to go on ad infinitum. This argument is also taken from Simplicus. C. If magnitude exists, it must be infinitely great and infinitely small at one and the same time. Since it has an infinite number of parts which are indivisible. Therefore, the idea of the manifold is contradictory. 4. The later Ionian school. A. Heraclitus. B. Anaxagoras. C. Democritus. A. Heraclitus, believed to have been born BC 530 and to have died in 470 BC. Heraclitus, a native of Ephesus in Asia Minor, has been credited with the following doctrines. 1. The doctrine of universal flux. There is no static being and no unchanging element. Change is Lord of the universe. The underlying element of the universe is fire, and all things are changed for fire, and fire for all things. A. The change is not at random, but uniform, orderly, and cyclic. Thus, the heavenly fires are transmuted successively into vapor, water, and earth, only to go through a similar process as they ascend again into fire. B. It contains the elements both of the old and new. At any given moment in the process, consequently, where night ends, there day begins. Where summer begins, there spring ends. And where mortal life ends, there spiritual life begins. C. It also consists in the generation which results from the union of opposites, a doctrine later to be found in Plato and Socrates. Hence we observe that the union of male and female produces organic life, and that sharp and flat notes produce harmony. 2. The theory of knowledge. Since sense knowledge, or knowledge derived from the senses, is illusion, it must be avoided, and true knowledge sought for in the perception of the underlying unity of the various opposites. This is possible for man, who is part of the all-comprehending fire which underlies the universe. But in the doctrine of the upward and downward paths, true knowledge comes from the upward path, which leads to the eternal fire, whereas folly and death are the result of following the downward path. 3. The doctrine of the Logos. That the hidden harmony of nature ever produces concord from oppositions, that the divine law, or universal reason, rules all things, and that the primitive essence recomposes itself anew in all things according to fixed laws, and is again restored by them. B. The life and teachings of Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras, a native of Clazomenae in Ionia, is supposed to have been born in 500 BC. Like all the other philosophers, nothing is known about his early life and education. He comes into history through a visit to Athens, where he met and made the friendship of Pericles, and where he was charged with impiety. He, however, escaped from prison and fled back to his home in Ionia, where he died in 530 BC. His doctrines included the following. 1. Nous, i.e., mind alone is self-moved, and is the cause of motion in everything in the universe, and has supreme power over all things. 2. Sensation is produced by the stimulation of opposites. We experience the sensation of cold because of the heat in us, and we experience a sweet taste because of the sour in us. These doctrines will be treated elsewhere as regards their source and authorship. C. The life and teachings of Democritus. 1. His life. Democritus, 420 to 316 BC, is said to have been the son of Hegestratus, and also a native of Abdera, a city at Miletus, an island in the Aegean. Both Aristotle and Theophrastus have regarded Leucippus as the founder of atomism, in spite of the fact that his existence is doubted. Like all the other Greek philosophers, nothing seems to be known about his early life and training. However, he enters history as a magician and sorcerer. 2. His doctrines. The name of Democritus has been associated with the following doctrines, summarized as atomism in his explanation of 1. The nature of the atoms and their behavior in relation to the phenomena of 2. Creation, 3. Life and death, and 4. Sensation and knowledge. 1. The description of the atom. A. The world stuff. The atom is explained as a colorless, transparent, and homogeneous powder consisting of an infinite number of particles. B. Their qualities. The atom is described as full or solid, invisible, indestructible, uncreated, and capable self-motion. The atoms differ in shape, order, position, quantity, and weight. C. The identity of the atom with reality. Every atom is equivalent to, quote, that which is, and the void is equivalent to, quote, that which is not. Reality is the movement of that which is within that which is not. 2. The atom in creation. Owing to the difference in size, weight, and mobility, and in particular to the necessity, there is a resultant motion by means of which the atoms combine themselves for the formation of the organic and inorganic worlds. 3. The atoms in the phenomena of life and death. What we commonly call life and death are due to a change in the arrangement of the atoms. When they are arranged in a certain way, life emerges. But when that arrangement is changed to another way, then death is the result. In death, the personality disappears, the senses also disappear, but the atoms live on forever. The heavier atoms descend to the earth, but the soul atoms, which are composed of fire, ascend to the celestial regions whence they came. 4. The atom in sensation and knowledge. A. The mind or soul is composed of fire atoms, which are the finest, the smoothest, and the most mobile. These fire atoms are distributed throughout the whole universe and in all animate things, and especially in the human body, where they are found in the largest numbers. B. External objects constantly give off emanations or minute images of themselves. These in turn impress themselves upon our senses, which set in motion our soul atoms and thereby create sensation and knowledge. 5. Summary of conclusions concerning the pre-Socratic philosophers and the history of the 4 qualities and 4 elements. 1. The early Ionic philosophers have been given the credit of teaching the following doctrines. A. Thales, that all things originated from water. B. Anaximander, that all things originated from primitive matter, i.e. the boundless. And C. Anaximenes, that all things get their life from air. But these ideas were not new at the time when these men are supposed to have lived, i.e. between the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The creation story found in the book of Genesis speaks of the elements of water, air, and earth as the cosmic ingredients of the chaos out of which creation gradually developed. The date of the Pentateuch is placed at the 8th century BC, but the view of the Mosaic authorship of Genesis takes us still further back into antiquity, and many centuries before the time of the Ionian philosophers. We are told not only by the Bible, but also by the historian Philo, that Moses was an initiate of the Egyptian mysteries and became a hierogrammist, learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptian people. This was only possible by proper initiation and gradual advancement. When evidence of fitness was demonstrated by the neophyte, the Egyptian name of Moses was given to all candidates at their baptism and meant, quote, saved by water. The exodus of the Israelites appears to have occurred in the 21st Egyptian dynasty, i.e. 1100 BC, in the reign of Bocorus, under the leadership of Moses, whose creation story of Genesis is clearly of Egyptian origin. It is clear that the early Ionic philosophers drew their teachings from Egyptian sources. 2. In the case of the Eleatic philosophers, history regards Xenophanes as a satirist, not a philosopher, and Zeno as a paradoxical concerning his treatment of the problems of plurality, space, and motion, which ultimately leads to a reductio ad absurdum. Parmenides introduced no new teaching when he spoke of being as that which exists and non-being as that which does not exist. He only re-emphasized the doctrine of opposites as a principle of nature, a doctrine taught not only by the Pythagoreans, but also the Athenian philosophers, chiefly Socrates. But the doctrine of opposites owes its origin to the Egyptian mysteries, which take us back to 4000 BC, when it was demonstrated not only by double pillars in front of temples, but also by the pairs of gods in the mystery system, representing male and female, positive and negative principles of nature. It is also clear that the Eleatic philosophers drew their teachings from Egyptian sources. 3. The latter Ionic philosophers have been given credit for the following doctrines. 1. Heraclitus, A. That the world was produced by fire through a process of transmutation, and B. Since all things originate from fire, then fire is the Logos, the Creator. 2. Anaxagoras, A. The nous, or mind, is the source of motion or life in the universe, and that sensation is produced by the stimulation of opposites. 3. Democritus, A. That atoms underlie all material things, and B. That the phenomena of life and death are merely changes in the mixture of the atoms, so that the atoms never die, because they are immortal. These doctrines were by no means produced by the late Ionic philosophers, but could be shown to have originated from the Egyptian mystery system. The Egyptians were fire worshippers because they believed that fire was the creator of the universe and built their great pyramids. Pyr equals fire. In order to worship the god of fire, and the pyramid age goes back to something like 3300 BC, several thousands of years before the Greeks were said to have come into the Mediterranean area. According to Jamblichus, the Egyptian god Ptah was the god of order and form in creation, an intellectual principle. This god was also recognized as the divine artificer who fashioned the universe out of fire. Furthermore, Swinburne Clymer, in his Philosophy of Fire, page 18, has made the following statement, quote, "The study of the mysteries of Isis and Osiris, Egyptian goddess and god, quickly proves to the student that it was a pure fire philosophy. Zoroaster carried those mysteries into Greece, while Orpheus carried them into Thrace. In each of these places, these Egyptian mysteries assumed the names of different gods in order to be adapted to local conditions. Hence, in Asia, they took the form of Mithra, in Samothrace, the form of the mother of the gods, in Boeotia, the form of Bacchus, in Crete, the form of Jupiter, in Athens, the forms of Ceres and Proserpine. The most noted of these Egyptian imitations were the Orphic, Bacchic, Eleusinian, Samothracian, and Mithraic. All of these fire worshippers believed that the universe originated from fire, and they lived at a time which antedated the time of the late Ionic philosophers by thousands of years. The other doctrines of the later Ionic philosophers, together with those of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, will be treated under summaries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Chapter 8, and will include 1. Opposites, 2. The nous or mind, 3. The logos, 4. The atom, 5. The theory of ideas, 6. The unmoved mover, 7. Immortality. 4. The Greek philosophers practiced plagiarism. The teachings of Pythagoras seem to have been so comprehensive that nearly all his successors embraced and taught a portion of his doctrine, which we are told he obtained by frequent visits which he made to Egypt for the purpose of his education. Two things are at once obvious. 1. That the Greek philosophers practiced plagiarism and did not teach anything new. And 2. The source of their teachings was the Egyptian mystery system, either directly through contact with Egypt or indirectly through Pythagoras or tradition. These facts can now be further demonstrated by an outline of the doctrines of Pythagoras, with the names of philosophers who repeated his doctrines. 1. The doctrine of opposites. The unit of number is composed both of odd and even elements, of the finite and infinite, and of the positive and negative. In this connection we find A. Heraclitus, suggesting fire to be the source of creation by means of the principle of strife which separates phenomena, and harmony which restores them to their original source. B. Parmenides, suggesting being as existent and non-being as non-existent. C. Socrates, attempting to prove the immortality of the soul by the doctrine of opposites. D. Plato, attempting to explain nature, used the theory of ideas which he based upon the principle of opposites. Consequently, the idea is true reality, i.e., being. Hence, the concept is real, but the thing which is known by the concept is unreal. The noumen is real and perfect, but the phenomenon is unreal and imperfect. E. Aristotle, in attempting to establish the existence of God, describes the divine attributes in terms of opposite. God is the first mover, that is unmoved. Hence, we have a combination of motion and rest as the attributes of deity and nature. 2. The doctrine of harmony as a union of opposites. After being expounded by Pythagoras, appears also in the systems of A. Heraclitus, who explains the phenomena of nature as passing successively through their opposites. B. Socrates, who also defines harmony as the union of opposites. C. Plato, who defines the harmony of the soul as the proper subordination of its parts, i.e., the higher and lower natures. 3. The central and peripheral fires. Here Pythagoras attempts to show that fire underlies creation, and this same notion is expressed by A. Heraclitus, who speaks of the origin of the universe through the transformation of fire. Then we have B. Anaxagoras, C. Democritus, D. Socrates, and E. Plato, each using the term mind, nous, as responsible for creation. Anaxagoras and Socrates, who speak directly of mind, nous, as an intelligence and purpose behind nature, while Democritus and Plato speak of mind indirectly as the world soul, but further describe it as being composed of fire atoms floating throughout space. Clearly then, mind, no matter what other name or function we give it, is fire, since it is composed of fire atoms, and fire, according to Pythagoras, underlies creation. 4. Immortality of the soul. According to Pythagoras, the doctrine of the immortality of the soul is implied in the doctrine of the transmigration of the soul. A. Socrates. The purpose of philosophy is the salvation of the soul, whereby it feeds upon the truth congenial to its divine nature, and thus escapes from the wheel of rebirth, and finally attains the consummation of unity with God. B. Plato's doctrines: 1. Transmigration, and 2. Recollection. 1. Transmigration. The souls of men go to the place of reward or punishment, and after 1,000 years they are permitted to choose a new lot of life. He who has thrice chosen the higher life gains, after 3,000 years, the home of the gods in the kingdom of thought. Others wander about for thousands of years in various bodies, and many are destined to pursue their earthly life in lower animal forms. It is necessary to point out that in this doctrine of transmigration, Plato describes the judgment scene in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. 2. Recollection. Although the sense-perceived world cannot lead us to a knowledge of ideas, yet it reminds us of the ideas which we saw in a previous existence. 5. Summum bonum. According to Pythagoras, the supreme good in man is to become godlike. This transformation is to be accomplished by virtue, which is a union of opposite in man's faculties, i.e., the subordination of man's lower nature to his higher nature. But the precise purpose of the Egyptian mysteries was to make a man godlike by the agencies of education and virtue. Consequently, it is clear that Pythagoras obtained this doctrine directly from the Egyptian mysteries. Hence, it also follows that philosophers who have taught this doctrine must have obtained it either directly from the Egyptian mysteries or indirectly through the teachings of Pythagoras. According to Sallust, deification, or becoming godlike, was the purpose of the Egyptian mysteries. And according to C.H. Vail in his Ancient Mysteries, the Egyptian summum bonum consisted of 5 stages, during which the neophyte developed from a good man into a triumphant master, attaining the highest spiritual consciousness by means of casting off the 10 bodily fetters and becoming an adept like Horus or Buddha or Christ. The philosophers, besides Pythagoras, who are given credit with having taught the doctrine of the supreme good, are A. Socrates, who defined it as an attainment in which man becomes godlike through self-denial and the cultivation of the mind. B. Plato, who defined it as happiness, which is the attainment of the idea of the good, which is God. C. Aristotle, who defined it as happiness which is based upon reason, and which includes all the gifts of fortune. It should be noted, however, that Aristotle's definition of the supreme good marks the first departure from the concept of the summum bonum of the Egyptian mysteries, and the same thing is true of the hedonist, who defined it as pleasure. The conception of a supreme good is Egyptian, from which source Pythagoras and other philosophers obtained the doctrine. 5. Summary of conclusions concerning Democritus. Because of the importance of the doctrine of the atom, and the great suspicion of his great number of books, like that of Aristotle, Democritus is treated separately, like each of the Athenian philosophers. 1. His life. The same thing might be said of Democritus as might be said of any of the men who were called Greek philosophers. Nothing appears to be known about his early life and training. However, he comes into history attracting public attention as a sorcerer and magician. 2. His doctrines and authorship. 1. Authorship. The authorship of the doctrine of the atom is doubtful, from the standpoint of view of certain modern writers. The names of the Ionians, Leucippus and Democritus, have been associated with this doctrine, which according to the opinion of Aristotle and Theophrastus originated through Leucippus but was developed by Democritus. As a matter of fact, the Ionians doubted the existence of Leucippus because he was unknown to them, and it seems proper that the opinion of the Ionians should receive credence rather than that of Aristotle and Theophrastus, who were Athenians and who were compiling philosophy in the interest of their movement. 2. The doctrine concerning the atom is eclectic. The doctrine of the atom, as explained by Democritus, is eclectic and represents one of the many forms in which the ancient doctrine of opposites has been expressed. The Pythagoreans expressed it by the elements of number, odd and even. Parmenides, being unfamiliar with the law of generation, denied the existence of one opposite, not being, in order to affirm the existence of the other, being. Socrates, being more acquainted with the law of generation than Parmenides, expressed it in several pairs of opposites in an effort to prove the immortality of the soul. Hence he spoke of unity and duality, of division and composition, of life and death. In like manner, Democritus expressed the doctrine of opposites when he described reality by the life of the atom, i.e., a movement of that which is within that which is not. The original source of this doctrine, however, is the philosophy of the mystery system of Egypt, where we find the male and female principles of nature symbolized by A. Osiris and Isis, the Egyptian god and goddess, and B. the gods Horus and Seth, symbolizing a world in static equilibrium of conflicting forces as they contend for dominion over Egypt. The doctrine and philosophy of opposites is further demonstrated by the Egyptian creation story, in which order came out of chaos, and which was represented by 4 pairs of opposites, male and female gods. A. Nun and Nonet, i.e. primeval matter and space. B. Huk and Hawket, i.e. illimitable and the boundless. C. Ha and Hawhet, i.e. darkness and obscurity. D. Ammon and Amenet, i.e. the hidden and concealed ones, the air, wind. Clearly, the doctrine of opposites was a basic philosophy of the Egyptians, being connected with not only the gods of their mystery dramas, but with their cosmology. And since this connection makes the doctrine one of the earliest in the development of Egyptian thought, it antedates the reign of Menes, and means that the Egyptians were familiar with it before 3000 BC. Under these circumstances, and in consequence of these facts, the Egyptian mystery system was the source of the doctrines A. of the atom and B. of opposites. Leucippus and Democritus taught nothing new, and must have obtained their knowledge of the doctrines from the Egyptians directly or indirectly. 3. The doctrines of the universal distribution of fire atoms and their emanation from external objects and derived from magic. These doctrines are magical and express the magical principle, quote, that the qualities of animals or things are distributed throughout all their parts, end quote. Consequently, within the universe, contact is established between objects through emanations, and in the case of human beings, the result might be sensation or cognition, healing or contagion. This principle is demonstrated not only by the cures such as were effected by the garment of Christ and the handkerchiefs of St. Paul, but also by the modern scientific and medical practice of the preventive measure of quarantine. It must be remembered that magic was part of the education of the Egyptian priest, for the religious rites and ceremonies of the Egyptians were magical, and the priests were the custodians of the knowledge. 4. A fourth point is the fact that in the history and compilation of Greek philosophy by Aristotle and his followers, there are only two men whose names are associated with the authorship of an extraordinary number of scientific books, and the names of these men are Democritus himself and Aristotle. 5. A fifth point which deserves important mention is the fact that in the history and compilation of Greek philosophy by Aristotle and his followers, it has been discovered that wherever there has been the possession of a large collection of scientific books, there has also been direct or indirect association with Alexander the Great. 6. The association between Democritus and Alexander the Great is seen through the Democritean circle, a succession of teachers and students from a common original teacher, Democritus, 420 to 316 BC, is said to have taught Metrodorus of Chios, who in turn is said to have taught Anaxarchus, who is said to have flourished at the time of the 110th Olympiad, 347 to 337 BC, and to have accompanied Alexander the Great on his campaign against Egypt, 333 BC. Here it is easy to see the tie between Democritus and Anaxarchus, for these men were all Ionians and members of the same school, and were alive at the time of Alexander's conquest of Egypt. On the other hand, Aristotle's contact with Alexander the Great is well known, since he was a tutor of the young prince at the Macedonian palace. 7. Circumstantial evidence points to the fact that the books of Democritus were not written by him, nor did they contain his teachings. This is so for the following reasons. A. Leucippus, whom the Ionians did not know, and whose existence has been questioned, have been given credit by Aristotle for the origin of the doctrine of the atom. B. Apart from what was written on the atom, the name of Democritus is associated with a large list of books dealing with over 60 different subjects and covering all the branches of science known to the ancient world. In addition to this vast field of knowledge, the list also contains books on military science, law, and magic. Clearly, the accumulation of such a vast range of knowledge by a single individual, written in a single lifetime, is impossible both physically and mentally. The method among the ancients of imparting knowledge was by gradual stages, followed by evidence of proficiency, which in turn was also followed by initiations, which marked every step in the progress of the neophyte. The progress of training was slow, and no neophyte could accomplish such knowledge in his lifetime as took the Egyptians over 5,000 years to accumulate. These human limitations are as true today as they were among the ancients, for our great scientists of the modern world are specialists only in single subjects. See, the question now remains, how did Democritus accumulate those books if he did not write them? We believe we have the answer because it has been noticed in the history of Greek philosophy that A. Wherever a Greek philosopher has had association, direct or indirect, with Alexander the Great, there was also the possession of a large collection of scientific books, and B. This is true in the cases of Democritus and Aristotle. C. Anaxarchus and Democritus were Ionians who belonged to the same school. And D. Anaxarchus accompanied Alexander the Great on his campaign against Egypt. The indirect association between Democritus and Alexander the Great now becomes obvious. E. It follows that since Alexander's conquest of Egypt had brought the Greeks their long hoped for opportunity, i.e. access to the Egyptian library and museum, we would naturally expect Alexander and his friends and the invading armies to have helped themselves with the Egyptian books. We would also expect Anaxarchus, upon his return to Ionia, to have sold at least a portion of his loot to Democritus. Nor do we expect Aristotle and Theophrastus to relate these facts to us, since under the rules of the mysteries, knowledge, spoken or written, could be diffused only by brethren among brethren. This, we believe, is the way Democritus came to possess such a large number of scientific books. Again, it must be stated that Democritus taught nothing new, but simply what he had learnt from the Egyptians, directly or indirectly. His doctrine on the universal distribution of fire atoms is based upon a magical principle. If the atom is an ingredient of the world, then it will be universally distributed. Furthermore, Democritus enters history as a magician, and since there is historical evidence that he visited the Egyptian priest, it is evident that magic was part of the training which he must have received from them. 3. His books are doubtful in authorship. Several important facts must be noted in connection with the books which are said to have been written by Democritus. A large number of books, which appears in a list in the 9th book of Diogenes. Laertius does not appear elsewhere in the usual textbooks on the history of Greek philosophy, while Zeller asserts that the genuineness of these books cannot be determined upon the evidence of the fragments. It seems that his list of publications remains doubtful in authorship. B. More than 60 different subjects are treated, and they include ethics, physics, astronomy, botany, zoology, poetry, medicine, dialectics, military science, and law. Also books on magic, including divination. C. We are informed by Diogenes Laertius that this large list of books was compiled by Thrasyllus about 20 A.D., who was a student of the school of Plato and also a member of Aristotle's movement, which had for its purpose the compilation of Greek philosophy. The 4 qualities and 4 elements. The history of the following ancient theory of, quote, the 4 qualities and 4 elements provides the world with the evidence of the Egyptian origin of the doctrines of A. Opposites or contraries, B. Change or transmutation, and C. The life and function of the universe is due to either of 4 elements, fire or water or earth or air. 1. This ancient theory was expressed by a diagram formed by outer and inner squares. 2. The corners of the outer square carry the names of the elements: fire, water, earth, and air. 3. The corners of the inner square, being at the midpoints of the sides of the outer square, carry the 4 fundamental qualities: the hot, the dry, the cold, and the wet. 4. The diagram explains that fire is hot and dry, earth is dry and cold, water is cold and wet, and air is wet and hot. 5. Accordingly, water is an embodiment of cold and wet qualities, and when the cold quality is replaced by the hot quality, the element water is changed into the element air with the wet and hot qualities. 6. Consequently, transmutation is definitely implied in the teaching of this symbol. 7. It is the oldest teaching of physical science and has been traced to the Egyptians as far back as 5000 BC. 8. It shows that Plato and Aristotle, who had been credited with the authorship of this teaching, derived their doctrines, or portions of them, from the Egyptians. End of chapter 5.